Hello and welcome to another virtual program with Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman, the Manager of Education and Public Programs. And this program is a book talk on the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook with the editors, Margaret and Karl, and with Don, one of the contributors. I want to introduce all our speakers properly before we get started. So Margaret Hathaway and Karl Schatz are the husband and wife team joining us from their kitchen tonight. They have written 5 books on food and farming, including the memoir, The Year of the Goat, The Guide to Living with Goats, and the 2 volumes of Portland, Maine's Chef's Table. Margaret is a writer who has worked in book publishing, corporate communications, and as manager of New York's Magnolia Bakery. Karl is a photographer who has worked as an editor at Time Inc. and also as director of Aurora Photos. Since 2005, the couple has lived with their daughters on 10 Apple Farm, a homestead in southern Maine, where they raise dairy goats, tend a large garden and small orchard, make cheese, teach workshops, and operate a guest house. Don Lindgren is an antiquarian bookseller specializing in print and manuscript books about food and drink. His bookselling business, Rabelais Inc., acquires, research, and sells rare books, manuscripts, ephemera, and other materials related to culinary history and culture, and performs appraisal and institutional placement services for collections and archives. He has lectured and presented at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, the Colorado Antiquarian Book Seminar, and Rare Book School's Boston seminars. He's currently working on a multi-volume exploration of the American Community Cookbook. Can you help me out with the title here, Don? American Cookbooks of Community and Place?
Yeah, that little abbreviation, it comes from a community cookbook, and it's just unexcelled with very few. Yeah, it's a contraction.
Excellent. And my understanding is that the 3 of you guys have really have done a lot of research, searching all over the state of Maine for great stories, photographs, and recipes that make up the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, and you're going to speak more about those with us this evening. So welcome, and thank you all so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having us. It's great to be here, and we're excited to talk about the book and everything that went into, its creation. It was really a project of love for us. It really all started in the spring of 2019. We had just finished work. Oh, I can start sharing. I've got some visuals that we can
please
kind of share as we're talking. Yeah, let's see. All right, is that visible? That's that's the Bicentennial Cookbook right there. If people haven't seen the cover yet, that's the cover of the book.
If our camera is on us, we're going to be a Zoom cliche. Our cat is walking back and forth on the counter.
Here she
comes.
That's great.
She changed her mind.
That'll just add to the fun of the experience.
2020.
So Margaret and I in the spring of 2019 had just finished work on the new Portland, Maine Chef's Table, which is the second volume of a cookbook that we had done with focusing. The cat is so distracting. With chefs from Portland restaurants and Portland chefs, and it was a compilation cookbook. And so we had just finished work on that, and a friend had posted a picture of Maine's sesquicentennial cookbook, which is that's the cover of the sesquicentennial cookbook. So someone had posted that on Facebook, and I saw that, and I reached out, kind of having compilation cookbooks on the mind because of the Chef's Table books. we reached out to the Bicentennial Commission to see if anyone was doing a bicentennial cookbook, and they said no, and with our blessing, go forward. And so we got the official designation of an official bicentennial project, which helped later on in terms of getting sponsors and advertising and things like that, which we'll talk about a little bit. And at that point, I think we went to, knowing it was a cookbook project, we sort of went to Dawn, who we was a friend and colleague of ours for years, and said, we want to do this cookbook project. What do you think? And we kind of presented it to him. And there were a couple of things that we knew that we wanted the project to be. We knew we wanted to be a collection of recipes from all over the state of Maine, that it would include recipes from all 16 counties. And we knew we wanted it to have a charitable component. We wanted some portion of the proceeds of the cookbook to go to organizations that were fighting hunger in Maine. And so we went to Dawn and said, Dawn, what do you think about this? And Dawn said, well, it sounds like you're doing a community cookbook. And we really didn't know much about community cookbooks, other than the fact that, our parents had them in the kitchens, and we probably have a few. Yeah. But we really didn't know much about it. And Dawn sort of explained, a little bit of the history and bit about community cookbooks, and we were just fascinated and captivated. And we said, yes, let's do a full-on community cookbook. And maybe it's a good time to sort of turn things over to Dawn, and you can kind of give us a little bit of background on community cookbooks in general and community cookbooks in Maine, and then we can talk a little bit more about the bicentennial book.
Absolutely. Thank you, and thanks to Maine Historical for inviting us to discuss this. I got interested in community cookbooks about 12 or 13 years ago now. It was a sort of subsection of the type of books I deal with, which are food and drink books and cookbooks. I also, my friendship with Karl and Margaret goes back beyond that, but is grounded in books, because one of the very first events we ever did as a cookbook shop back on Middle Street in Portland was with them for their first book, Year of the Goat, which still I think has got to be the only Maine-based cookbook event with live goats in it. So at some point, though, I just kept seeing these books that were very sort of sometimes interesting, sometimes unremarkable. I knew about the category of community cookbooks. And then I started, one of them really caught my attention, and you can see in this picture some of the community cookbooks from around the state. Although there's one outlier, the Appledore cookbook, which is really not a community cookbook, but has Maine roots. That sort of dark brown rectangle at the bottom that it's hard to read. This is another copy of the book here, which is equally hard to read. This is Fish, Flesh, and Fowl. This is the very first, there we go. That's much better than my copy. That is my copy, but a different one. This is the very first cookbook that was completely produced here in the state of Maine. It was compiled here, and it was printed and published here and distributed. And it's a community cookbook from Portland in 1877. It's fairly well known now as the earliest of that, and there are some interesting books that precede it, but aren't really full-blown cookbooks that were produced here. This also meets all of the requirements for what a community cookbook is as a category. It was a relatively new category when this book was produced in Maine. The very first community cookbook that's known is from Massachusetts in 1870. It's called Nantucket Receipts. It's a tiny little 16-page book. It's a miracle that any of them survived. And this book, just 7 years later, produced here in Maine, was the first of what would become many, many community cookbooks. And so first, just the definition. And Karl touched on some of this stuff. When he was already, Karl and Margaret were leaning into this project, they were already thinking that they get recipes from around the state, that there'd be a charitable aspect to it and the like. And those are some of the fundamental parts of the community cookbook. The first is that there's an identifiable community. So in Fish, Flesh, and Fowl, this was the ladies of the State Street Parish in Portland. That was the community, the ladies and then the rest of the parish. The recipes would be drawn from within that community. That's the second part. And the third part is that there would be some sort of charitable or social aspect to the book, some sort of better, some sort of good that was trying to be achieved by raising money through the book. With the Maine Community Cookbook, the community is much larger. It's the entire state of Maine. And the recipes are drawn from the entire state of Maine. And then there is a larger social fundraising aspect to it, as Karl and Margaret, with the help of the rest of us, are choosing various food-related charities around the state for some of the proceeds of the book to be directed toward. So this book and the Maine Community Cookbook share their fundamental structures. And then they have a couple of other things I'll just touch on quickly because I'm sure Karl and Margaret want to talk about it too. They also have advertising in them, and the advertising helps to pay for the production of the book. And we would think of that today as crowdfunding. You go out in advance, you raise some money, then you can produce your project, whether it's a book or an album or a movie or just trying to do something at home. You can raise money in advance and then do it. The second aspect is that these recipes being drawn from all over the community, that's crowdsourcing. Another thing that we're familiar with today as a sort of modern idea. We're going to go out and we're going to get our content from all of these people, scattered around. Well, community cookbooks have been doing that since the beginning. So there are these common things that these two books have in common. And I'll just say that in between Fish, Flesh, and Fowl and the Maine Community Cookbook, there is a remarkable almost 800 community cookbooks that have been produced in the state of Maine. I've been collecting them now since that 12 years ago that I first got excited by Fish, Flesh, and Fowl. And from between 1877 and right now, there are almost 800, and they represent the entire state, and they also represent every type of social organization you could imagine, which is an amazing cultural and social record of what's going on in Maine communities, large and small. Karl and Margaret?
Oh, great.
Oh, yeah.
I can keep going, but
I know. So basically Dawn, gave us this incredible introduction into this really deep history of community cookbooks, and we were really hooked, and just having the time, to sort of spend at Rabelais, leafing through some of these old books and looking at the old advertisements and stuff like that. We really got even more excited about the project. And when we first sort of envisioned it, we started kind of looking. We were thinking that we might just find one big sponsor who would kind of write a big check, and we would do it with them. But as we thought about it more, and Dawn, kind of showed us the way that some of these community cookbooks had done it with advertising, we really decided to embrace the crowdfunding piece of it and look, sort of the modern tools of crowdfunding, which in our case was Kickstarter. So in November of 2019, we built a website that would allow us to receive recipe submissions and photos and text from people, and we simultaneously launched both a Kickstarter crowdfunding campaign and a campaign for crowdsourcing, to asking people to send us their recipes. And we were very fortunate. Very early on, Maine Public Radio Broadcasting got on board as our kind of primary media sponsor, and they were incredibly helpful in getting the word out to people that we were doing this project, and send us recipes. And we also reached out to newspapers and magazines in the state, and the Maine Library Association.
Well, and because we had just done a kind of similar book, a food book that was a compilation book, we had been talking to a lot of sort of the right people to help get the word out. So we suddenly started receiving hundreds of recipes.
Yeah.
And the Kickstarter campaign was obviously successful, which was great. And, you know, within a couple months, we had 400 recipes, and the book really started to take shape. And the editorial process, you know, became kind of the winnowing of the first recipes, the first round of recipes, and then really trying to shape what the book would look like.
Yeah, I mean, from the beginning, we knew we wanted the book to be, we wanted the majority of the recipes in the book to be just from kind of everyday Mainers from around the state, but we also knew we wanted it to have a little bit of I don't know, celebrity appeal, and we wanted to have some, to try to get recipes from well-known Mainers, and we got recipes from Stephen King and from Patrick Dempsey's family, and from all of the all of our Congress people and senators.
And we're fortunate enough to have the governor provide the foreword, which was really fun.
Yeah, we reached out to the governor's office, and this is of course all happening pre-pandemic. So at the time, there was a lot of excitement about the coming bicentennial and what was going to happen, and I think, and at the time, you know, there were a lot of bicentennial events planned. And so this was all taking the editorial process, the submission process of recipes. It started right around Thanksgiving and through Christmas, and it ended at the end of January 2020, and then we began the editing process.
But because it was tied to the bicentennial, part of what we wanted to do, which is not traditional to community cookbooks, is also to provide a little historical context to the evolution of food in the state that we call Maine, by having some food historians provide essays, and some more contemporary sources talk about food insecurity and the experience of new Mainers preserving their cultures through food. So as the book took shape, we were reaching out to people who were providing essays, and there became a more narrative element. As much as the recipes, there also became some storytelling as part of it.
Right, and I think as the recipes started coming in, one thing that we really, I don't think we're quite prepared for and didn't fully anticipate was the power of the stories, the family stories that began coming in with the recipes. And very quickly, I think the book really took shape as much around the stories as the recipes themselves. And people talking about, you know, their mother or their father or their grandparents, and this recipe, you know, continuing to make this recipe because it reminds them, you know, every time they make it, of being in their grandmother's kitchen or their grandfather's farm. And it was really, I mean, there would be mornings we would wake up and read our email, and we would just, like, tears would be rolling down our face, because it was just so moving to read these stories and to be so intimately invited into people's lives in a way that we just didn't really anticipate.
Well, and people, in addition to recipes, started sending us their, you know, grandfather's unpublished memoir and pictures from Thanksgiving years past. And because we were collecting recipes around Thanksgiving and Christmas, a lot of these recipes, people, you know, are nostalgic, and this time of year can be really hard when you're thinking about, you know, people who used to be with you. And so we got these just outpouring of emotional testimonials of people's lives
history
and family histories.
Yeah.
And that really shaped the way this project came together.
Yeah, I think we were thinking of it primarily as a collection of recipes, but I think more than anything, it's almost a collection of stories, and the recipes are are great, but in some cases almost secondary to the stories, which are really the most powerful piece of the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there was one other element that we were really we wanted to make sure was included, which that even though the bicentennial was sort of the impetus for putting this book together, we definitely felt it was really important to acknowledge that the history of food in the state that we call Maine is not a 200-year history, that the history of food in Maine predates statehood, that there have been people living here and hunting and foraging and cooking for centuries before Europeans were here. And we felt it was really important to acknowledge the Wabanaki contributions to Maine's food history. And so we made a concerted effort to reach out to the Wabanaki Confederacy and find someone who could provide a little bit of that context. And we were really, really fortunate that Professor Darren Ranko from the University of Maine provided a really wonderful short essay just about Wabanaki food history and food sovereignty in the state of Maine, and kind of both framing it as a historical piece, but also as a current piece, that this is something that's continuing, and it's an important piece of Maine, contemporary Maine food, as well as historic Maine food.
I just want to add that in addition to the intro, Karl and Margaret asked if I would look through the historical books, not just the very old ones, but some of the more recent ones as well, and identify 20 recipes that would be included that would, have a range geographically across the state. They'd have a range of different types of what was typical recipes that we were finding. We might use it to actually pad out a section if one section turned out to be a little weaker than we might hope. That didn't turn out to be an issue. We got things from everywhere around the state. We got things in every category we wanted. So then I could just sort of pick the recipes that seemed interesting. And what was so fascinating to me were two things. One was that I had the same sort of emotional reaction that Karl and Margaret had in receiving some of the recipes that were sent to me. Because as a kind of nerdy historian person, more than a cook or an author or a cookbook author, I'm usually on the dry side of things. But I was feeling like the process of compiling, of receiving these recipes, was connecting me with all of the people who have been compiling books, historical books that I've been working with for ages, whether it's community books or otherwise. That this is the process that has been going on until quite recently, and still goes on, but it was the dominant process for creating cookbooks. And then to look at those 20 individual books, I had to write a very short thing. And at first I thought, great, I'll write a little thing about each one of these 20 recipes. But what was so interesting to me is that some of the recipes were interesting because of the person who provided the recipe. Some of the recipes were interesting because the recipe came from someone else who was interesting 3 generations earlier, and they were necessarily looking backwards at something. Some of the recipes were interesting because it was a young person who was like engaging very modern contemporary food. And actually my niece, Maya Flores in Kennebunk, provided a recipe, one of the early ones in the book, and it was very modern. As a matter of fact, it might have been one of the most modern things in the book, which was kind of cool.
So.
She's a kind of a science geek, and she loves food science and stuff. So it was just represented what food was for her and what excited her about having a recipe in a book. And without elaborating on it much, there was also one recipe in the historical ones that it was a brownie recipe, and it sent me down a deep rabbit hole of research into the role of Maine and the brownie, which I'm not really ready to talk about yet, but at some point it's going to be pretty interesting because there are about a half a dozen major food history reference works which say that, yeah, there's this Maine story about brownies, but we know it's not really true. Well, these community cookbooks are starting to show evidence that maybe there are stronger roots for the classic American brownie here in Maine than we thought. So, you know, they were just like, every one of these things had a different thing that was exciting about it to me as a food historian. And yet it was this very simple home compilation of recipes. That's what's so exciting. They're completely simple. It's a simple structure and a simple thing that's created. Most of them are kind of humble in their appearance. I think this book's much more handsome than many of the ones that are made. But the idea that there's all this complexity of social and cultural information, of contemporary food and historical food, of food that represents our ingredients that are here, and food that represents ingredients and processes and traditions that come to the state of Maine with all of our new arrivals, or the new citizens in Maine. It's, you know, it's just it's layers and layers and layers of social history, and that's what really turns me on about books like this.
Yeah, it was really important that we make sure that the new Mainers were represented here and their foods, because we really did want it to be, you know, not just a history, but also, you know, looking forward, like what is Maine at the bicentennial? What does Maine food look like? And it looks like recipes that people have been cooking in their families for generations, but it also looks like what are the recipes that are being cooked in Maine homes today. And a lot of those recipes have origins of food that is not what you would necessarily think of as from Maine, but outside influences. And so we reached out to a number of communities. We were really fortunate to connect with a group here or nearby in Portland, in her presence, or in her kitchen.
No, in her presence.
In her presence.
Yeah.
And they were able to connect us with some of the women that they work with to get some of their home recipes. And then there were recipes that came in just organically that represented wave after wave of immigration into the state of Maine. So we have, you know, recipes from the Greek. There's a Greek donut recipe from the Greek community in Biddeford.
From the Lebanese community
from
in Waterville.
The Lebanese, yeah. And then we've got a recipe from Laotian chef who's now working in Bethel and Auburn, and a recipe from him. And I think I'm sure there are others
many,
that
yeah.
I'm not remembering. There's a couple of recipes. Well, my great grandmother was a kosher caterer in Portland, and so we included one of her recipes, which actually appears in a Jewish community cookbook from Portland. And there was another recipe from a Jewish community cookbook from Waterville that we included. And I think one of the other interesting things that we saw happen with the recipes that were being submitted is that a lot of the recipes that people were submitting as their own family recipe were recipes that became their family recipe because it had come from a community cookbook, that their family had received this community cookbook and started making this recipe, and then it becomes their family recipe.
There was actually one recipe for, I think it was for a chow chow, right? A relish. And Dawn had given us the recipe from a historic book. And someone had submitted their family recipe, and it was the exact same recipe.
Wow.
But their family had adjusted the amount of turmeric. That was the only difference. And so we ended up, because by the time we were working on the editing, we really had to winnow things down. I mean, if it was up to us and pages were unlimited, we would have, you know.
Our original plan was 200 recipes for the bicentennial, and we kind of thought, you know, when we were sort of sketching it out, we thought, okay, there'll be about 100 recipes from kind of around the state from everyday Mainers. We'll have maybe 50 recipes that we solicit from chefs and other people, and maybe 50 recipes that come from some of these historic books. But we were just so overwhelmed by the recipes that were coming in from all over the state that very quickly the number of solicited recipes and historic recipes, we kind of had to shorten up to make sure that we could get, as many of the submitted recipes in as possible. And to be honest, there are actually more than 200 recipes in the book.
There are 200 if you don't count.
Yeah, because there were just so many amazing stories and recipes. We couldn't narrow it quite down to 200.
Yeah.
This is so wonderful. It is kind of amazing. I mean, I grew up with those, with community cookbooks. They were very much a part of our kitchen, and creating them, in the different communities, that my family and I were a part of. And it is amazing how much of our memory and our nostalgia, how much meaning is tied to certain recipes and dishes from our family, and the kind of memories and feelings that they can evoke looking at them and sharing them with people. So I think it's wonderful that became a part of the story and the history that you guys are telling in this cookbook. It's not just a collection of recipes. You're really giving it a lot of great context. And I really appreciate too how you say, it's not just 200 years worth of recipes. We're talking traditions that go back thousands of years, and also some that are very, very modern, or very tied to very modern people, tied to people today. I just think that's really what you've put together is really valuable on so many levels.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
When we were at the end of the editorial process, was like the middle of March of this year. And so the whole world went upside down and changed a lot. And I know for me personally, seeking refuge in this book and in the editorial process and in these family stories of people who had been through, the 1918 pandemic, but times just as challenging, more so, and had come out the other side with a resilience and with stories and these recipes that that they could build their next phase on. It really helped me feel like the world would be okay ultimately. Yeah. And it felt like there was community, every day in my computer, maybe not, in my kitchen.
Yeah. At the same time, we were editing, people's stories about scarcity and not having enough to eat. And, we're also, dealing with food, shortages in the grocery stores, and food insecurity, rising. And so it felt very just immediate, even though it was, supposed to be this sort of,
historical retrospective. It actually very contemporary.
Yeah.
I want to remind folks too that are with us, if you have questions for our speakers, please feel free to type them into the chat or into the Q&A. One question that we're getting from someone in the audience, did you try out these recipes? Were you cooking any of them?
So we
more than 200, maybe. Yeah. We probably didn't have enough time to try them all, but how many have you tried?
Deliberately during the editorial process, we did not test any. We assessed them to make sure that all the ingredients were there, that the instructions, with a little bit of cleaning up would be clear. But we deliberately chose to believe that people were sending us their best. And if they said their family loved this, then whether it's to my taste or not, it's worthy of inclusion.
Sure.
Since then, we've probably made about 50 recipes, I think, over the last few months.
Yeah.
Everything has turned out incredibly well. And things that I was initially skeptical of. Like, I will confess, there were some recipes that I was like, is that gonna work?
Yeah.
And everything has been wonderful, from claptrap to lemon sponge pie to colcannon, which didn't make it into the book but is on the recipe cards and is now a family favorite. We have, everything has been delicious. So
yeah, I mean, part of it was just time. We were in an incredibly compressed time schedule to try to get this book out in time for the bicentennial, and so there was logistically no way that we could test all the recipes. But Margaret had put we'd done 2 cookbooks where she was converting recipes from chefs into for home cooks, and she knows what goes into a recipe and what needs to be there. So we felt confident that that we would be able to. And
we had a gathering at Rabelais before
the pandemic. Yeah, in February,
where we had, I think it was 4 other cookbook authors and food writers from around Maine, and the 3 of us sat down and looked through all the recipes that had come in so far. And so there were a few that were easy to sort of say, I don't think that, if you don't have X in a recipe for Y, it doesn't work. There were a few that were easy to kind of put to the side. There were a few recipes that the recipes themselves were maybe duplicates of something we had, but the story was so charming that we left the story in without a recipe. But yeah, everything so far that we've made has been great.
I'd also point out that the that sort of from a historical point of view, that the recipes most frequently wouldn't have been tested in these books, except that many of the recipes that end up in these books did appear at the Grange Fair or the county fair or maybe the state fair and did well. It's one of the reasons that they're in there in the first place, is that Mrs. Smith's blueberry pie and Mrs. Jones's blueberry pie and the third blueberry pie were all blue ribbon winners in 3 successive years. So they all have to be in there. In historical books, you see that all the time. So I feel like it was a safe thing. And then having Margaret and Karl at the helm and knowing what makes good recipes, but also that review process with a number of really great cookbook authors was valuable, even if the recipes weren't tested themselves.
Yeah.
Another question from our audience. Someone's actually asking about, can you speak to the publishing decisions, like the size of the book, or when we look at a lot of those old community recipe books, they've got the spiral binding, but one doesn't, do you know much about, and I also assume that they're asking about the pricing. I assume $20.20 is a nod to the bicentennial.
Yeah, it was.
It is, and it's a money-losing nod. Like, the book was not priced appropriately for.
Well, we originally thought the book was going to be 240 pages, and it ended up at 280 something, I think, just because we just ended up with so many recipes. So it was kind of priced for 240 pages, which. But it was never meant to be a money maker, other than we wanted to make sure that we were raising money for the charitable cause. But we felt it was important that we wanted the book to look like a contemporary cookbook as much as possible, and to have a professional printer do it. And actually the printing is the only piece of the whole project that happened outside of the state of Maine. It was really not financially feasible to have it. We looked into having it printed in state, but it just would not have been financially possible. But we worked with Island Port Press. We got them involved early on. We knew in Yarmouth, we knew we needed to have a local distributor, a Maine-based distributor, to help us with the distribution piece. So they are handling all the wholesale sales and distribution for the book, and also helped sort of walk us through the printing process. They manage that piece as well. But the designer who designed the book is based here in Maine. The editors and copy editors are all here in Maine, and all the recipes came from Maine. And you know, in terms of size and binding, we were again trying to keep to the 2020 price tag, just because we wanted it to be an affordable book for people. We didn't want to, you know, a $30 book just felt like it was going to be too much we wanted to make sure people would be able to get the book and enjoy it for the bicentennials.
And feel comfortable splattering it with things from the stove, or making notes in the margins, you know. A book that's hardcover and has sort of a fancier binding, sometimes you feel a little skittish about doing that, but we want people to feel like
right
this
in
is
the
a
margins.
notebook. Exactly.
Make your notes. In fact, we've gotten a couple of comments about recipes, and you know, temperature, you know, was missing from this recipe, because we really did, for the most part, publish the recipes as they were submitted to us with whatever the names were. Sometimes there might be a misspelling, but if that's how that family spelled it, that's how, you know, how we were gonna honor that family's recipe.
Yeah, we made sort of they were pretty hairline decisions between some of the things, but
we sort of see that as an opportunity for the home cook to you know, add their own notes. If the temperature is, you know,
it's listed as moderate, then
you can decide if moderate is 300 degrees or 325 degrees, and please make a note in the margin, and you know, then it becomes, you kind of own the recipe. It becomes yours. And
well, and Dawn probably knows this too. When you go like way back to say that like book of, you know, receipts from Nantucket, sometimes a recipe is just a list of ingredients. There are no instructions, because the assumption is the person I'm giving this to knows how to put it all together. They just need to know what goes into the particular recipe.
Sure. The format of recipes changes dramatically. The way the recipes are printed on a page, how much space the recipes take up on a page, all of that, it changes over time. And the reason it changes, it's being influenced by all sorts of things, like what we were just talking about, like cost, like the technologies of printing that are available to the people making the book. You know, most of the community cookbooks that were produced at the beginning of the community process time period, from the 1870s through, say, the 1930s, just generally speaking, most of those were printed and bound locally. So the books produced by community groups in Biddeford printed and bound them in Biddeford. And, you know, maybe one used a binder in Saco, but it was all very local. There used to be 3 printers, you know, for sort of small job printers in Biddeford alone. So people had options of where to go, and they had relationships with those printers. They were probably members of the church, which is part of how the whole process worked, is those advertisements helped pay directly to the printer, who was all local. The spiral binding that was brought up by the person with the question, those come in because those little printers and binders start to disappear locally as everything consolidates, because that's just the way things went. Historically, it was, you know, printers got bigger and had larger equipment and were in the bigger city and not in each town individually. So as that happened, people had to make you know, workarounds. And so you end up with this series of changes. The community cookbook is not just one thing. It's not just a spiral bound book of a certain size. They used every sort of printing technology and binding technology. And that's also a reflection of what was going on in their communities. That's also a reflection of the economy of their place. So there's a tremendous amount of information just from the parts of it that we might think of as just, you know, choice. Why is this book in cloth and this other book is bound in wallpaper? Well, it's because wallpaper was available. Somebody donated 10 rolls of wallpaper from the hardware store to the auxiliary, and that's what the book was bound in. It's neat and it's creative.
Yeah. I love the project really kind of was kicked off last year around Thanksgiving. That just seems so appropriate, and when a lot of family recipes would be on folks' mind. Is there anything off the top of your head? We're in the midst of the holiday season that you might recommend as a good recipe, for your holiday table.
Well, I just want to quickly give a shout out. We are doing currently with Maine Public and the Bangor Daily News, we're doing a 6-week holiday cooking challenge from the
awesome.
I think we're in week 5. So there's this week and next week is the end of, but this week's recipe is the cranberry pudding.
With a hard sauce.
With a hard sauce.
Nice.
And that's this week's recipe. So that was one that came in. It's a holiday recipe. I mean, it fits nicely in between Thanksgiving and Christmas because it's kind of a Christmas pudding cake.
Christmas style with Thanksgiving ingredients.
But with the Thanksgiving, the cranberries, which is also a shout out to Maine, a great Maine ingredient, cranberries.
What I was going to say is because it was Thanksgiving, just us and our kids, we actually made almost our entire Thanksgiving dinner from the community cookbook.
Wow.
So we made they were vegan pumpkin seed croquettes. And help me out, we made claptrap, which is delicious.
We made the upside down apple
tart.
Westport Island, upside down apple pie.
The cranberry relish. Mamie berries.
Mamie berries, cranberry relish.
What else?
There's one other thing.
There are so many great recipes for this time of year.
It's really full of recipes that are great Thanksgiving or Christmas recipes.
Our daughter is angling to make the popcorn molasses balls.
Oh, nice.
Which I'm sure will result in a lot of burns, but it'll be fun.
That actually, that begins to answer another question that came up, which was about whether the book includes recipes for confections or candy, and it does, because confections and candy were one of the more popular categories in community cookbooks historically, and it's got we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 recipes. Of course, Needham's, the molasses corn balls that Margaret mentioned. There's a microwavable peanut butter fudge, which comes from a state prisoner in Warren in Knox County. So that's another community group. It's a group of people, and it was good to have them represented. And there's one I'm really interested in, which I have yet to make, which comes out of one of the historical books, which is a flaxseed candy, which comes from the Ladies of Bangor collection of family receipts of 1882. And that's one I'll probably make sometime soon.
That's wonderful.
There's also another question. Somebody asked about sales and the proceeds, and Karl and Margaret can speak to the proceeds better, like some of the charitable organizations better than I can. But yes, the book's for sale on Amazon and doing really well. But I would just point out that, and you can buy it there, and we're grateful for all those sales. For sales that go through the website itself, the Maine200cookbook.com.
Maine200cookbook.com.
It guarantees a slightly larger portion of the proceeds and a quicker path to the donations that are made. It's just a little bit more direct for that process.
But the book is in most or all Maine bookstores and gift shops, certainly Sherman's and Print here in Portland. We're both sponsors of the book, so we want to definitely give a shout out to them. As far as the organizations that are benefiting from the proceeds, we have a page on our website at Maine200cookbook.com that lists the organizations that have received distributions so far from the project. So if you're interested in seeing, who is benefiting, then you can go to that page, and there's a list and links to their website. So you can also, if you want to make your own additional contribution to those organizations fighting hunger in the state of Maine, you can do that.
And if you know of any organization that's doing good work in fighting hunger in Maine that isn't listed there, please send us an email and put it on our radar, because we would love to be able to
support them. And I think we're hoping to, we want to make sure that the distributions benefit organizations in all 16 counties, and I think we've tried to spread it around as much as we can. I think there's still probably a few counties that we haven't donated to yet, but certainly
the donations at this point have only come from direct sales.
So we're waiting to, once we have sales reports from Amazon and Island Port, then we'll be able to distribute more funds
in the new year.
In the new year.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I can attest to how well the book is selling. If we haven't sold out at Maine Historical Society, we're very close to selling out. And I know that our merchandiser, the woman,
more books are on the way.
Yes, she's hoping we'll get more in very soon. But if you can't get it at Maine Historical Society today, we've got those other great bookstores that you guys mentioned, and we'll have it back in stock soon too. If you go to mainhistorystore.com, you can, like I said, you can find hopefully copies of this book, if not today, then soon, and lots of other great books on Maine food history, which is just, it's a really fascinating topic, and it's so great to see you guys making this wonderful contribution to it. We'll wrap this up in just a moment. I want to give the audience, if anyone has a last minute question they'd like to ask, now would be a good time. And remind folks too, in addition to mainhistorystore.com, you can see all of the great upcoming programs for Maine Historical Society if you visit mainhistory.org. And if you're interested in becoming a contributor too, if you've got a great family story about food or a wonderful recipe that you'd like to talk about, you might consider sharing that story on My Maine Stories. So visit our database, Maine Memory Network, mainmemory.net, where you can become a contributor to the online database, or you can submit your own Maine food story. We've got quite a collection there, but we would love to have more. I also want to tell folks too, we're going to stop the recording in a moment, but don't go away, because Margaret and Karl wanted to give away some goodies to our audience. So even after the official goodbye, folks, stick around and you might have the chance to win a prize. But before we close, Margaret, Karl, Dawn, is there anything else, any other projects that you're working on that you'd like to tell us about, or anything else that you'd like to say as far as closing remarks?
I think just, it's really been a remarkable project for us to work on. It's really, I don't think we anticipated when we started this project how meaningful it would be. And of course, we certainly didn't anticipate a global pandemic when we started this, but it really, or the cancellation of all the bicentennial events, which we thought, we thought this was going to be a really, just a different year. And so to be able to have this book out there celebrating the bicentennial in a year when so many other celebrations had to be canceled, it's been really wonderful to both be on the receiving end of so much, but also feel like we really contributed something to the state during a year when there was a lot that didn't go the way that we thought it would.
Yeah, during a year when we could really use some sense of community.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, and I think, during a year that, in addition to the pandemic, there's been a lot of turbulence in the culture this year, and it was very affirming to be working on a project that that reminded us that our core values are all so similar, and that we can gather at the table and share a meal and feel community. It was a affirming project.
That's great.
I agree, and I feel connected to people in parts of the state I've never visited. Food does that, and usually it does it with people sitting around a table right in front of us. But in this case, it was able to span a greater piece of geography. But it's the same feeling at the end, and it was a welcome feeling in a difficult year. I'm going to add one tiny thing, which is that if you want to see this Fish, Flesh, and Fowl, there's a copy on exhibition right now at the Portland Museum of Art as part of their bicentennial exhibition. There's a small section that has a number of historical books and menus and other items related to Maine's food history, and so you can see the Fish, Flesh, and Fowl in the flesh as a tiny little brown book, if you'd like.
That's great. Well, thank you guys again so much. Thank you for this project, and thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge with us this evening. This has really been wonderful.
Oh, thanks for having us. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.